Hello everyone, and welcome to the 220th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Invincible Season 3. Well, I said in the Omni-Man video I released in January that we'd be covering this series piece by piece as each season released, so here we are. And we're doing it this way because even though the comics have finished, not everyone has read the comics, so I'd much rather cover what the vast majority of people have seen of the show, so I don't spoil the story for most of you. I made a pretty long intro going in depth about this in the Omni-Man video, so if you'd like a longer explanation, feel free to head over there to find out more. But because that intro was so long, let's keep this intro rather short and just dive right into the video. But not before I mention that I've started a new gaming channel that you should all definitely check out by clicking the link down in the description, or by clicking the card on your screen. Now without further ado, let's begin. There are a bevy of moral questions and dilemmas either introduced or expanded upon in this season that has given us plenty to discuss in regards to evil, and there are 6 topics in particular that we'll be delving into over the course of this video, those being the dangers of extreme ideologies and unchecked mental illnesses, sinister government programs and their moral ambiguity, the dangers of immersing oneself in the criminal world, the dire consequences of dedicating one's life to revenge, the horrors of the Viltrumite Empire and their dreaded ideology, and where to draw the line when it comes to killing sapient beings. Let's start with the item I mentioned first, the dangers of extreme ideologies and unchecked mental illnesses. Doc Seismic, a villain who plays a recurring role in both the show and the comics, is the perfect embodiment of the archetypal mad scientist and characterization of the more cartoonish elements often associated with supervillains. He's loud, boisterous, prone to belting out one-liners, and as mad as can be. Despite the ridiculous and comedic nature of his character though, Doc Seismic is still a villain who desires at first to tear down the social and political order of the United States, but then transitions into being one that wants to erase all of humanity from this planet, so the Earth might heal and return to a more natural state. On the surface, that doesn't seem too bad, as there are certainly sins committed in our past that haunt us to this day, and the Earth could use a bit of healing in many respects. No, the problem isn't necessarily Doc Seismic's ideology, it's the extreme way that he's chosen to implement it. Doc Seismic isn't trying to make meaningful changes in a peaceable way. He's trying to force the changes he wants to see in the world to happen through violent action that has resulted, or has nearly resulted, in the deaths of scores of innocents, and no matter what ideology you ascribe to, whether it be left, right, up, down, or any other direction leaning, it's never right to murder innocents in the pursuit of your ideals. And if your ideology has the murder of innocents baked into it, well, that's even worse. There is not a single innocent person living or dead who ever deserved to die for the sake of quote-unquote bettering the world. So if you're hurting innocent people to achieve that, it's wrong. Plain and simple. There are evils in this world that all of us wish we could eliminate, but to take the path towards rectifying those evils that Doc Seismic took is ultimately one that sees you fighting fire with fire, that is evil with evil, and subsequently becoming a villain far more heinous than the ones you initially set out to destroy. However, as Cecil notes during Doc Seismic's attempt to destroy Mount Rushmore, it's speculated that the seismic bracelets he created caused him to suffer some pretty severe brain damage. So while it's very important to emphasize how dangerous extremism is, it's also pertinent to highlight the fact that Doc Seismic is a person in desperate need of help, as the strain on his psyche caused by the brain damage he suffered only amplifies his adherence to his extremist ideology and pushes him into taking increasingly more drastic action in an attempt to see his goals realized. And judging by his internment in a prison in Season 2, it would seem that Doc Seismic has not been granted the care he needs to overcome the gargantuan mental hurdles plaguing his mind, which only emphasizes something that we've talked about extensively in many different videos on this channel, the role mental health often plays in a person's conscious or subconscious decision to turn towards evil. Something that doesn't necessarily excuse the actions of someone like Doc Seismic, but provides us with insight that allows us to understand further why a person does the horrific things that they do, and how to prevent other people from taking their lives in that direction in the first place. As true as that may be, there are people and organizations in this world who seek to embolden and control people like Doc Seismic, lucid or otherwise, to further their own ambitions, even if those ambitions might be semi-virtuous in nature. And such is the case with some of the actions taken by Cecil Stedman and the government he represents in this story. One thing that we learn in this story is that there are quite a few superheroes like Rex, Eve, and Duplicate and Multipol who did not become superheroes of their own free will. Rex was sold to the government from a young age and experimented on to give him his powers. Eve was engineered from birth to have the power she has so she could be the ultimate weapon of the US government. Though it doesn't seem Kate and Paul had their powers engineered, they, like Rex, were given to the government at a young age so they could be trained and made into the superheroes the government needed them to be. Now, as heinous as doing these things might seem, when taking into consideration the world that these people live in, what the government has done to these people is more so morally gray than anything. On the one hand, it's not right to take children from their parents to train them to be superheroes, as I'm sure it's more than possible to create superheroes by recruiting willing adults to go through the processes these children were put through. But on the other, you can understand why a government that exists in a world that's filled to the brim with kaijus, supervillains, and alien conquerors would feel it necessary to take this path. And when taking into account the number of lives saved through sacrificing the childhoods and autonomy of a few people, it becomes all the more understandable. We don't know if the US government in this alternate version of our own world tried every other approach to this situation before they decided that doing this to people was their only choice. But I'd argue that's the only way that this particular method remains morally gray, or perhaps even good. As if taking this course of action was their first or second choice here, then it's more so wrong than it is morally gray. And much like this practice, there is another taken by this government that falls into the morally gray category. The use of cowed supervillains to either fight for them or manufacture weapons and the like to bolster their defenses against all the threats I mentioned a moment ago. In episode 2 of this season, which is appropriately titled A Deal with the Devil, we learned that before Cecil became the director of the GDA, he was an agent like any other, and after being horrifically scarred by a group called the Order of the Freeing Fist during a mission, and put back together by the GDA following it, Cecil learns that the director at the time, a man named Radcliffe, had reformed and recruited the two top members of the Order, Knucklebuster and Force Fist, to fight for their side. Something that Cecil, who believed at the time that all criminals deserved to be punished according to their crimes, refused to witness idly, and so he chose to murder both of them on the spot. After spending some time in prison though, and reflecting on the actions of his superior, Cecil was approached by Radcliffe to head the GDA, as he believed him to be the right man for the job going forward, which he turned out to be, as after becoming director, Cecil went on to perfect Radcliffe's methods and put together an agency that did much to save lives and prevent disasters from occurring in the future, with the likes of Sinclair and Darkwing providing him with rehabilitated manpower and weaponry that greatly bolstered the world's defenses. Now, unlike the government's forced creation of superheroes from children, what Cecil and his predecessor have done to rehabilitate villains is solidly morally gray, as in truth, as much harm as the people they've chosen to take in have caused, they have seemingly more often than not saved more lives than they have destroyed. We can be the good guys, or we can be the guys that save the world. We can't be both. Cecil's mantra that perfectly sums up what he's allowed to occur under his watch. And while it isn't right to allow murderers and the like to gain a new lease on life by becoming loyal servants of a government, it actually might be when you consider the good they do as a result of their service. As much like the US government's recruitment of German scientists after World War II, perhaps it's better, at least in certain scenarios, that arch criminals and supervillains help right the wrongs they committed through allegiance to more benevolent causes. For in reality, the world we live in is not black and white, and all situations and scenarios need to be judged on a case-by-case basis. And in this case, perhaps Radcliffe, Cecil, and the organization they represent have the right of it. Now Titan, a man we were introduced to in Season 1, has had quite the interesting arc. Initially an underling of the crime boss Machine Head, Titan, with the help of Invincible, managed to get the better of Machine Head and took over his organization, in the process becoming a crime lord himself, but one who, unlike someone like Machine Head, has made efforts to better his community whilst going about his business, which by the time Season 3 starts, has resulted in much good occurring under his watch. However, being in a position like the one Titan occupies comes with many hazards, one of those being the notion that there's typically always a bigger fish to be wary of in the pond, and in this case, that fish is one Mr. Liu, the head of a criminal organization known as the Order. Liu, who employed Multipol as an assassin, approaches Titan to demand that he pay his dues to the Order and break out Multipol from prison. But not wishing to be beholden to a villain like Liu, Titan initially refuses. However, after being convinced that to do so would be folly, he chooses to follow through with Mr. Liu's request, though he ultimately fails during his first attempt to do so. And unfortunately, a man like Mr. Liu is not one to pat you on the back and tell you that you tried, and it's okay. And so a saga ensues wherein Mr. Liu threatens Titan's family, and then subsequently takes matters into his own hands when Titan continues to refuse his commands. While these men are obviously criminals, and there's much to be said about the evil that is committing crimes, what this string of events really aims to highlight for us is the notion that no matter how nobly and well you play the criminal game, there are always going to be consequences associated with being a criminal. And Titan, though a man with a good heart and good intentions, was not immune from suffering those consequences. He did manage to realize that the life he was living was a danger not only to himself, but to his family, and so he ended up handing the reins back over to Machine Head. But with confirmation of Mr. Liu's survival after we see his subordinate reviving him, it's highly likely that Titan will continue to suffer the consequences of the decisions he's made. And the lesson here is that the only way to not suffer those consequences at all is to never turn to a life of crime in the first place. For as attractive as it might seem in the beginning, more often than not, the criminal life you lead is only going to harm you, your loved ones, and the innocents you prey on in the long run. providing little to no benefit for anyone involved. Something that is also highlighted through the story of the would-be supervillainous couple that we see turning to crime to solve their problems at the beginning of episode 3. And well, honestly, you could apply this line of thinking to any villain in this story, or any villain at all for that matter. Next on the docket is a discussion of the fallacies of leading a life dedicated to revenge, of which we're given 3 examples to look to. In Season 2, we were introduced to Angstrom Levy, a man with the power to traverse dimensions, who had plans to use the collective knowledge he had gathered from his other selves to create a paradisal world that would be a veritable utopia straight out of our grandest fantasies. However, when Invincible was called to the disturbance Angstrom created with the help of the Maulers that he intended to use to facilitate his goals, Mark refused to listen to his pleas for understanding and attacked him, which caused Angstrom to undergo a horrific transformation as he absorbed the memories of each of his alternate selves into his own mind, which then drove him mad as his mind constantly shifted between terrifying images of all the havoc the other versions of Invincible had wrought on each of his alternate selves' worlds, which caused him to focus all of his once noble efforts on exacting revenge upon Invincible Prime. While this initially led to him threatening Mark and his family in Season 2, in Season 3, this evolved into a full-scale plot to entirely destroy Earth Prime through his recruitment and use of an army of evil Invincibles if it meant getting his revenge on Mark, which of course ended in Angstrom's eventual defeat, and then veritable slavery to the entities that had put his body back together after his first run-in with Mark, but not before thousands upon thousands of innocent lives were destroyed in the process. Now, while Mark's initial knee-jerk reaction to stop whatever Angstrom was doing shouldn't be excused, Angstrom's inability to see that he'd become the very thing he tried to stop in the first place is ultimately what led him to be in the miserable state that we find him in, as even though his mind had been so sundered by the various experiences that had been forced into it, he was still more than capable of pursuing the noble path he had set out on. But unfortunately, much like Doc Seismic, the damage he had suffered to his psyche was so severe that without any outside help, he was likely doomed to take this course, no matter what. Regardless, his story is still one of a cautionary tale that lays out for us the idea that the pursuit of revenge, more often than not, leads to a cataclysmic amplification of the dreaded feelings that pushed you to pursue such a path in the first place, or worse. Multipol, who chose to take a darker path when compared to his sister, had become an assassin for the Order as I mentioned earlier, and a man who ended up also suffering the consequences associated with his brief pursuit of revenge. While his story isn't as expansive as Angstrom's, his decision to target Rex as the man responsible for his sister's death led to him being placed in prison. And while he ended up escaping during the chaos wrought by Mr. Liu, the life Paul leads is bound to eventually cause him to end up right back in that same cage, or worse. Another reminder that revenge and a life of crime are more often than not going to cause you far more harm than they will good. Scott, the man who like so many others had to suffer the loss of loved ones following Invincible's battle with Omni-Man in Chicago, is our next example. Scott lost his sister and niece in this battle, and unable to bear the thought that Invincible remained free afterwards, he decided to try and make it so Invincible would be held accountable for what occurred through legitimate means, like by organizing a petition and presenting that petition to the DA. However, when that failed, Scott, who was employed as a scientist at the GDA, chose to steal some experimental discs that allowed him to become the superhero known as Powerplex, which he hoped would aid him in stopping Invincible the hard way. With encouragement from his wife, Scott proceeded to attempt just that. But in the process, not only did he not achieve his revenge, but he also ended up causing the deaths of his wife and child, with his actions afterwards granting him a prison sentence. The lesson is clear here. No matter what horrific things have occurred in your life as the result of the actions of others, revenge rarely, if ever, leads to those wounds being healed, as whether you or your loved ones suffer some serious harm in the process, or you achieve your vengeance and realize you're just as empty as you were when you made the decision to dedicate your life to revenge, matters little, as the answer will always be the same. Revenge is never worth it, and it often creates more evil than the acts that pushed you to pursue this path in the first place. Now, perhaps the most interesting display of evil we were treated with in this season was the appearance of, and ensuing actions of the Viltrumite, known as Conquest. Appearing on Earth to take over Mark's charge of assimilating our planet into the Viltrum Empire, Conquest embodies everything horrifying and wrong about Viltrum. Standing at an imposing height with a muscular body and a face etched with cruelty and madness, Conquest is the living embodiment of Viltrumite brutality. As he explains to Mark, he exists solely for the thrill of the hunt, to feel the warmth of blood cascading down his fists as he crushes his enemies, something that he's so good at that he's never once failed to assimilate a planet. Conquest is everything you'd expect a man like him to be. He's vicious, brutal, sadistic, and utterly without mercy, a man who enjoys killing anyone, no matter who they are, with reckless abandon and savagery, and strangely enough, a childlike playfulness, and a dash of sick tenderness as well, as there is a moment where we see him wiping blood from Mark's face in a rather intimate way, and another where we find him blowing a bubble made from his own blood and shaping it into a heart, actions which only serve to heighten the unease that we feel in his presence. Who knows how many millions or perhaps billions have fallen to Conquest's fists over the course of his long life, but it stands to reason that he may be the one Viltrumite in all their history who can claim to have the highest body count. Despite his sickening nature and barbarity though, we learn something rather sorrowful about a man who we should rightfully abhor with every fiber of our beings. That being that he didn't really choose to become the man he is. When he's about to end Mark's life, Conquest chose to share a bit of personal information with Mark before he sends him off to his grave. He tells him that his existence is an empty and lonely one, that all the other Viltrumites are scared of him because they think he's an unstable monster who can barely be controlled. He goes on to tell Mark that he's a victim of his own success, an animal who's proven himself to be so ferocious that he doesn't even get a real name, and that some days he feels so alone that he could cry, but he doesn't, because after all, what would be the point, as not a single person in the universe would care. As odd as this admission might seem, it makes sense when you consider what Conquest says about being alone, as who else does he have to confide in, if not a person who's going to take his deepest, darkest secrets to the grave? But more than that, his admissions here highlight something incredibly tragic about Viltrumite society that we touched on in the previous video on Omni-Man, that the Viltrumites have created a society so singularly focused on conquest and domination that everything else that makes life worth living is entirely foreign to them. Omni-Man came to realize that the wonderful experiences he had during his short time on Earth that were rooted in love, acceptance, and freedom were far more meaningful than anything he had witnessed or experienced over the long centuries of his service to the Viltrum Empire. And in his short time on Earth, even the maniacal Conquest caught a glimpse of why Nolan chose to betray his people for the sake of what they view as lesser beings. I am capable of so much more, but no one sees it. Something Conquest says to Invincible during their fight that perfectly sums up the plight of every Viltrumite. They, like any other sapient beings, are capable of being anything they wish to be, but because of the conformist nature of their empire, whoever they might have been elsewhere is stifled by the all-consuming might of Viltrum. Perhaps to become a man like Conquest is the fate of every Viltrumite allied with the Empire, for it stands to reason that he is the oldest amongst their ranks, and thus the most corrupted. A man who's lived his life so soaked in blood that he's become a monster to even the monsters who made him. Now, our last topic of discussion for this video is arguably the most important: knowing when killing another sapient being is noble and virtuous, or evil and villainous. Throughout this season, Mark had been presented numerous times with this moral dilemma, with urgings to ignore his steadfast rule to not kill anybody, frequently being challenged by Oliver, who doesn't understand where Mark is coming from. Oliver has only been alive for a short time, and he knows roughly of the murderous ways of his father and the Viltrumites, and how effectively killing can solve problems. Though it's true that it can, Oliver wasn't there to witness the crimes of his father, and being unaware of just how horrific murdering other people is, it makes sense that he's eager to solve his problems the easy way. Mark, however, was, and because of what he went through, he's afraid of becoming a man like his father, and rightfully so. As noble as his desire to not let himself become like the Viltrumites is though, his fears in this regard were only preventing him from seeing the truth, that sometimes in order to protect the ones you love, and other innocents, killing is necessary. There are 3 perfect examples were given of this being true in this season. The first is the havoc caused by an alternate version of the Immortal in the far future that was never going to end unless someone stopped him for good. In this dystopian future, the Immortal has been set up as ruler of Earth after Mark chose to leave it for some unknown reason with his family in tow. At first, he was a benevolent and kind ruler, but over time, as the weight of his long existence continued to plague his mind, and he lost so many loved ones due to the unceasing march of time, his behavior became increasingly erratic as he slipped further and further into madness. With the most restrictive curfew possible in place that stipulates that people are only allowed to go out to their work camps or attend a public execution if it's a family member, constant senseless wars, automatic factories churning out millions of autonomous royal guards, and entire nations punished and forced to survive without power or technology, this dystopia is quite possibly one of the worst we've ever been presented with in all of fiction. As much as all that occurred here is the Immortal's fault, because of his fractured mental state, he's incapable of ending his own misery, and also blames Mark for everything, believing that the only way to solve the crisis he and the world are currently facing is for Mark to return and end his life. Now, we've already discussed the other 2 examples well enough, those being Angstrom Levy's war against Mark, and Conquest's, well, existence, and there is no world where anything less than killing all 3 of them before they were able to cause as much harm as they did wasn't the best option. The Immortal and Angstrom were clearly too far gone to see any sort of reason, and Conquest, being a ruthless killer who knows nothing but brutality, made it so all 3 of them could not have been stopped by any other means than total destruction. Mark had a hard time coming to terms with this, and it was only once he survived his fight with Conquest that he finally realized that unfortunately, it's sometimes necessary to kill another person. Is it a good thing that things got to such a dire point in each of these scenarios that it required the taking of another life to rectify them? Absolutely not. Is killing another person a life-changing event that will scar you and corrupt you in some small or big way, no matter who you are? Yes, it is. And that's why Mark was right to be wary of doing so for so long. And that's also why it's so important to emphasize that killing is only ever appropriate in defense of yourself or others, as even then, it's liable to warp your person in ways you could never imagine. But sometimes, you have no choice. Sometimes it's necessary to shave off a bit of your humanity to defend those you love or other innocents. And as much as we can decry the cruelty of the world and the circumstances it places us in, ultimately, when it's time to act, it's time to act, and there's no way around it. For one life is surely not worth thousands upon thousands. So that, my friends, was all the evil and the intricacies of it that could be found in this season of Invincible. And I must say it may just have been the best season of this show yet. There was a lot to ponder here, and I hope I presented what we all witnessed over the course of this season in a thought-provoking way. But as always, I encourage each of you to challenge anything I've said here down below, or to expand on anything that I discussed in this video, as we can all benefit from more insight on these morally charged topics. I for one can't wait to see what comes next in this series, but for now, we'll just have to be content with the stellar seasons we've been given so far. And though it may be a year or longer before it's time for me to make another episode on this series, I think I speak for all of us when I say that I can't wait for the next season of Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Invincible? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially Elijah Kai VA, our Dark Lord channel member. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.